if we go back to our story of Rome and we remember that we're thinking about Rome as the extension of Christianity, the figure of Luke is very helpful to us here tonight, because his story, his book, his writing is all part of why Christianity ended up in Rome. And that's the big question we have here tonight. Luke the Evangelist dates could be anywhere between 5 and 10 A.D. People said he lived at the age of 84. If he did, he had a very long life. There were other people at his time who had lives just as long. But if he was really 84 when he died, then he might have been born at 1, 2, 3, or 4. The important thing about Luke for us tonight is that he comes to Rome. He comes to Rome. And so his life and his work and his book are what connect our themes that all come together here tonight in this story of Jesus of Nazareth, of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of Paul, and of these other figures who are so important. Now, the very first thing we want to remember about Luke when we talk about him here is that Luke is part of the age of the book. And it means that the story of Luke and the books that he writes too, and the tradition with which his books will appear, are an extension of the great Jewish tradition in which the Jews wrote their books, studied their books, edited their books, returned to the study of their books, memorized their documents, and then handed them along. In this sense, Christianity and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Paul are going to be handing along the already ancient tradition of writing down the stories, writing down the prophets, writing down the histories, Samuel, Kings, and studying them and handing them along and turning them into their own collection. So what we're entering into here in terms of history, of human history, is a new age, the age of books, not the ancient age of the oral tradition, but a new age, the age of the book. And we live in the age of the book. We have been in the age of the book for 2,000 years. But we should realize that here with the Jews and the Christians, they bring us into that ancient tradition of the book, of the accent of the book, the study of the book, the reproduction of the book. And it means there's now a cultural revolution that's taking place. And part of that revolution will be libraries. And we're going to have great libraries all over the ancient world, in Rome and in Alexandria and later in Constantinople. And the world of the book and the world of the library and the study of the library will all yield now a whole new way of thinking and of sharing information, because you will be able to study the book, copy the book, carry the book to another location, share it with someone else, and therefore you enter into a whole new world, all different than the oral tradition, all different than the rhetorical tradition. We are part of that new world, that world of the book. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the letters of Paul, the book of Acts, these are very important works for us to understand as part of our world, our modern world, our world that we live in now, in which publication, writing, reproduction, transferring of information is all available to everybody. Now we, of course, have other ways to copy the works, but in these days, even the manual copying that went on, hundreds and hundreds of copies of books, was still a way to save information, share information. So let's remember the role that Luke has in the world of the book, the world of the written book, and the sharing of the book, and the migration of the book, the movement of the book all over the world the study of it. This is an extension of the Jews and their commitment to books. And so this is one of the great ways, of many ways, in which the Jews and the Christians are sharing a certain value. Here's one of the good ways in which they will be doing so. What do we know about the copies of these books that we're now picking up here tonight? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Do we know when they were written? That's the first big question. Do we know when they were written down? I think we do. There's 200 years of research behind us on when they were written. A lot of people for a long time thought they were written very, very long after Jesus' life. That was the tendency, early 20th century, to push it way further, way into the 100s. And now the movement is exactly the opposite, to read the text and attempt to place, in relation to all the books written at that time, put the date somewhere much, much closer to the year we know Peter and Paul are in Rome, and that's 64 AD. That's a key year for our story, 64 AD, because that's Nero in Rome, Nero persecuting the Christians. We know a lot about it, and we know that there were a lot of Christians in Rome already. We know they were persecuted. And so that tells you a lot already right there, just that one piece of information. Remember, that's information not coming from the Christians. That's information not coming from Israel. That's coming from Rome. And the most important person to write about it is the Roman historian Tacitus. Tacitus was probably the greatest Roman historian, certainly one or two of the greatest historians, born in 56 AD, died in 117, so he's living during the second half of the first century. And his paragraph in his History of Rome is one of the most important things we have in order to date, in order to have some idea of where this is in time. Here's a section of his book, his History of Rome book. He's writing about Nero and the year 64 and the fire in the summer of 64. Consequently, this is Tacitus, to get rid of the report, he's referring to another blaming Nero, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians, by the populace. Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, meaning the Christians, thus checked for the moment, meaning by the persecution of Jesus, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of this evil, and you see his point of view, he thinks this is all terrible, these Christians, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty, and then upon their information, an immense multitude, note that, an immense multitude, that's a very interesting phrase, meaning a lot of people, meaning a lot of Christians in Rome in 64 AD. That's a very interesting information. Not so much of the crime of burning the city as of hatred against mankind. More likely it would have been a crime against their gods, because the Christians could always be convicted of refusing to worship the Roman gods. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with skins of beast, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight expired. That's Tacitus's description of the persecution of the Christians in Rome in 64. Now, that tells us a lot of things. Number one, he's a Roman historian. He's a great Roman historian, so he's reliable. Number two, there were a lot of Christians in Rome in 64 AD. Number three, we know from other sources that Peter and Paul were in Rome in 64 AD and almost certainly died in this persecution of the Christians. So that gives you a window for possible creation of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's almost certainly somewhere between 64 and 70, or at most maybe 75. Now, there's another piece of information that narrows it down and puts it even closer to 64, and that is, as many of you know, you just saw the painting of the destruction of Jerusalem a second time in 70 A.D. That's the Emperor Titus. Now, if any of these writers, and this is my opinion and many people's opinion, but if any of these writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, had known about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, they would have included it in their book, because it would have been the absolute verification of Jesus' prophecy that the temple would be destroyed. So if they knew that it had been destroyed in the year 70, they would have included it. Now, you can go home and read all four of the books and tell me if you find a place where any of those four say the temple was destroyed. I don't think it exists. And so, if that's the case, and you can go check this. Any one of you can go home and read Luke and see if you find a reference in his book. But you won't, I can tell you. Go home and do it, but you won't. So that narrows down the production of at least Mark and maybe Luke to that window between 64, the fire, the persecution, and the destruction of the temple in 70. What about the actual copies of the books? We're talking about books now. We're still talking about books. So what about the actual copies of the books? I'm putting up for your pleasure this picture of the John Rylands papyrus fragment called P52. And the reason I'm showing it to you, that's it on display there in a display case. It's, of course, the most precious fragment of the Bible on the planet, so it's nice that they're willing to show it. I'm sort of surprised they are willing to, but they do. And it is the text of John 18, verses 31 to 33 and 37 to 38. Now you're just seeing a little piece of it. There's also writing on the other side. So you, as always was always the case, they would use both sides of the papyrus. So that is the oldest fragment. In any case, there is the John Rylands Library manuscript P52. John Rylands Library is in Manchester, England. It was found in the desert of Egypt, of course, extremely dry, so that's how these papyrus can survive for thousands of years. And so it's very valuable. Now, why is it so valuable? Well, because it is almost 100 AD. In other words, it's so old that it's a piece of a New Testament fragment close to the year 100, meaning almost within the lifetime of John, because almost everybody agrees John was 90 when he died, which is way out at the end of the century. So in other words, you have a very slight gap between the oldest of the circle around Jesus or followers, John, and the oldest surviving fragment of the Bible. That's not much of a separation, 10, 20 years. So that means that the accuracy of our papyrus fragments of other sections show us that our Bibles are very accurate. There wasn't a big separation in which, various unknown versions were going to be produced. How many manuscripts do we have of the New Testament, surviving ancient Greek manuscripts? 5,000. I know. It just knocks you out of your seat. More than anything else from the ancient world, by thousands. Most go back before 350 BC. If you want to compare to other great works from the ancient world, for example, Livy's Histories, we have 20 manuscripts of Livy. Or Thucydides, the great Greek historian, we have 8 manuscripts of surviving of Thucydides. So you can see the number of ancient Greek manuscripts surviving are huge compared to all other ancient literature. Most of these New Testament manuscripts go back even to the 200s. Some go into the 100s, and the John Rylands goes down into the very early 100s. And the apostolic fathers, that is, writers about Christianity in the first century, attest to the existence already in, say, 90 of the existence of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So people refer to it. So you moved the books very, very close to the actual events. The books, the copies of the books that have survived, have moved very, very close.